So it's lovely to be here with all of you today. I want to welcome you to this talk on the topic of global language justice, and specifically on the chapter called Language Justice in the Digital Sphere. But first, I want to welcome everyone. It's Friday afternoon. We're going to keep this fun. We're going to keep it light. And we're going to learn a few things, hopefully, and have some interesting conversations as well. But it's very lovely to be here with you in a, end of the week book talk. I feel very honored to have had the opportunity. I know I very much enjoyed the first two book talks with His Excellency Sheikh Mansour bin Salam, of course, and then our colleague as well, Baltazar Ohea. Excellent and very inspiring content and perspectives shared there. And I know that not only those big shoes to fill, there's also big shoes that are coming after me, because we have so many brilliant colleagues here at the OSC. And I really look forward to the ongoing book talk series and feel very privileged to be a part of that. I'd like to thank Dr. Jamochiti, Mr. Mwawandi Montali, and Ms. Rosalind Kazenwa for inviting me to be a part of this. And I also very much want to thank my discussant today, Ms. Hadjer Mokhtar Benounane. Apologies for any mispronunciation. And I felt very privileged that she agreed to be a discussant today. The topic of my chapter, of course, cuts across a number of areas here at the Organization of Southern Cooperation, but I felt that Hadjer's perspective on translation in particular would be very enriching to the topic today. Translation is a very enriching and complex process. I think of translators personally as artists, and their medium is words, and they have to work across different languages, and they have, a vast understanding of language that is really important in bridging our world together. And I think sometimes we can take for granted the work of translation, but it's really, I think, a very deep one that speaks to who humans, what humanity is, and also how we can bridge the divides that we face, that sometimes language can create between us, but also can celebrate the beauty of language and the way that it defines the unique nature of us as individuals and collectives and communities. And so I'm very pleased that you agreed, Hadjer, to respond, and I can't wait to hear your remarks. And I'm also very happy to be here at the podium today. I miss teaching. I've been a teacher for many years at various levels, from young children to high school to also university level, and I have to say it was a bit exciting to prepare my remarks and be able to share thoughts with others today. So before we get into the book and the chapter itself, I wanted all of us to take a moment to kind of engage at a personal level on reflecting on the life world of languages, which is the major theme of this book. And I want us to think about the way that languages connect us here at the OSC and how they connect us across our work in the Global South and across the world. And I want to honor the incredible language diversity that is in this room. I think that's one of my favorite parts about being at the OSC, is that as I enter a room, I am likely to hear different languages. Some I'm familiar, some I am completely unfamiliar. Sometimes I'm hearing mixed languages or different languages being spoken at the same time. I hear people answer their phone and yet another language is being spoken with family members back home. And I think that's an incredibly enriching part of our community. And I think we only probably see a surface level of that. In fact, I think it's much richer than we may even realize. And I was thinking it would actually be, if we had time, and maybe this could be done sometime in the future, a very interesting exercise to actually collect all the languages that are spoken at the OSC, because I know there's many very multilingual colleagues here as well, and maybe even have a visual representation of that for ourselves, or even for our guests as they come in, to know that all of these languages are represented here. Of course, we have our 4 OSC languages, but we go much further and broader than that. And I think language diversity is one of the things that makes the Global South particularly rich in terms of the culture, the knowledge, and the perspectives and the interrelations of people. And it's something that I'm glad that we do celebrate here at OSC. So I want you to take a moment to reflect on the languages that you speak. So maybe just put up a few fingers, and I want you to also be, I know for myself there's languages that I would consider mother tongue, of course, maybe some I've kind of mastered along the way, and some that I feel like, oh no, I only have, only a small familiarity. But if you feel inclined, you can put up a few fingers. I think I'll put up like maybe 4 if I'm being very generous. How many languages are you holding with you today in your life full of languages? And you can just look around the room and let's see. We have a lot of languages here. And some people, I know it's even hard to count sometimes, right? Especially if you go to the ones where maybe you don't say you're the perfect speaker, but they're still part of our lives. And so I would also say, let's take a moment to say hello to the neighbors around you in whatever language you should choose. Just say good afternoon, perhaps. I was enjoying So there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of excitement, right? And I have to give a shout out. I don't know if Juan is here, but Juan is my favorite multilingual greeter. Every morning I get a different language. He's trying to get me to speak a little French, which I'm so far terrible at, but I like it when people mix in the languages. So to connect it back to the book, this book called Global Language Justice strives to train us to listen differently across mutual unintelligibility and differences, to recognize that our shared future in the planetary neighborhood rests on embracing the languages and cultures of distant peoples, to discover the truth of the life world of languages, and to find hope and beauty again in the midst of crisis and catastrophe. So this is a book that is edited by Professor Lydia H. Liu and Professor Anupama Rao. They are some mentors of mine and colleagues as well from my past life before OSC. And I wanted to share a little bit about how this book came to be. It's an edited volume that grew out of a Mellon Sawyer seminar that took place at Columbia University in New York City from 2017 to 2019 plus, kind of extended beyond the funding period because of the interest in the topic among many of our group of scholars. So in 2017, I completed my PhD in communication at American University, and I was selected to be a postdoctoral fellow as part of this project. We organized a number of public lectures. Some of the lecturers are people who then contributed to the volume. So very interesting scholars exploring the life worlds of language and how we can think about language justice. We had reading group discussions. We hosted a symposium on the sidelines of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, focused on Indigenous language with Indigenous leaders who shared many of their experiences and collecting thoughts about how as a world we can move forward in terms of honoring and keeping vital Indigenous languages among the communities that speak them. I designed and taught 3 courses at Columbia based on some of the content and beyond that's shared in this book, and helped moderate and edit a blog that you can all look at if you're interested, called Explorations in Global Language Justice, that many of my students contributed essays to, and I still send student essays to people, in fact, because they're very brilliant, and it's a resource that continues to serve people interested in this topic. And I was also able to be a part of the organizing kind of committee that developed the idea of this book as one of the products that came out of this Sawyer seminar as a way to share the topics that we had explored and our knowledge, and hopefully help to inspire more work, but also more scholarly work, but also more practical work in the areas that we have presented here. So I like the statement that you can read in the introduction that says, "The collective effort to shape the book also shaped us, and in turn we hope the book will shape a more just world." So a little bit about the structure of the book. So it's an edited volume with the work of 13 scholars included, and it's combined with bilingual poetry from 5 poets admired in our age, and also the work of exceptional translators of those poetry, and in some cases kind of historical religious texts. And I thought the inclusion of poetry in multilingual translation was very in line with OSC too, and it reminded me of the way that we've been very privileged to have His Excellency our Secretary General use poetry to, I think, open our hearts and minds to topics in a different way than logical arguments can. And also, of course, for example, the work of Dr. Lamco to bring that into some of our activities recently as well has been really a beautiful addition. So these have been included with the idea that poetic voices and art embody our vision of global language justice in concrete form, and that a reworking of justice requires poetic imagination. So I want to share one poem with you today from the book. So this is called Becoming a Child from Zai Yangming. At Chivitella, I became a child. Closing my eyes, my soul cast itself into 5 different roles. One went to Mexico, one to New York, one to England, one to Brazil, and one was left to ramble around Italy. Closing my ears, birdsong all around, it's the language of antiquity, and I understand there are 5,000 languages in the world. How many can one person master? Every 2 weeks, one of them dies. I fly after them like a bird, but they're dying faster than I can catch them, each with its own inherited codes, cycles, and types. When humankind was newly born, we spoke but one language. As the world has grown larger, languages have grown hungrier. Like black and white tigers devouring the weak, they have flooded the cities, morphed into computer languages, begun gnawing away our brains. When language becomes a kind of virus, humanity will be infected. Only the world will be sealed off. Only children will be immune. 5,000 languages will die, leaving but one. To become a child is to change 5,000 into one, to question the world with a child's mind, to speak like hands, to read like light, to connect like a shadow with nature, soul to soul. I drop down to the grass to get closer to the sky. To become a child is to become a language. So I won't attempt to explain such a poem, but I would point out that the reason I chose to share it is that I love the way that this poem draws on some of the contradictions when it comes to language. For example, we can experience it as a barrier for us to connect to one another. This is where translation is so important, and in fact, this poem is written in Mandarin Chinese and translated. And I should note the translator's name as well. So there's a longing in us, in a way, for a world before we had those divides. So if we can imagine that at the beginning of history, there was no language divide. And also to think about when we're children and the way that language doesn't divide us in a way. I'm sure we've all seen young children from different parts of the world playing together, and they really don't even need language to do so. So it also deals with the conflicting emotions we feel when we learn facts such as 40% of languages are slated or predicted to be going extinct across the current century. And it also touches on the role of technology in intermediating our relationship to language and to one another, and the kind of ambiguous feelings that we might have about that, which is a particular theme of my work. So I want to give a couple more statements regarding the book as a whole, and then I will dig into the chapter that I wrote for this collection in more depth to share that with you, because I'm best able to speak to the work that I particularly did. Yet nonetheless want to share the book as a whole because I do feel it's very relevant to the OSC mission on many levels, and I've recommended that it be purchased by the library. So I hope it will be available for those. You can also borrow my personal copy if you want, if you're interested. So I've already had one colleague who read a few from my personal copy, so that was very, very nice to have the interest. So to deal with the book as a whole, it addresses the visible and invisible disappearances in our world. It's equating or trying to compare the way that ecological disaster, biodiversity, disappearances are somehow linked to loss of language, both in terms of where these things are happening, also the rates in which they're happening. Of course, we see huge loss of biodiversity currently, and also languages are often correlated in those same areas. And for example, we see interesting correlations such as that indigenous people live on lands with 80% of the biodiversity in the world, and they also speak 60% of the languages. And we can imagine having lived for so many centuries with that level of biodiversity, the amount of knowledge that these communities maintain about how to live with that kind of biodiversity and live in those particular environments. And unfortunately, with loss of language, often due to things like displacement of people, forced migration, climate change, of course, war, sometimes even genocides, also pushes for urbanization, capitalist encroachment on lands like we see in the rainforest, for example. All of these things mean that, you know, many of the communities that speak the largest percentage of our approximately 7,000 languages in the world are now radically, you know, often unwillingly, radically forced to shift their lifestyles, and with that comes often the loss of the transmission of language to the next generation, or within a couple generations, that language vitality is decreasing. And we expect that while many have disappeared, around 1,000 languages have disappeared in the last 20 years, we do expect that many thousands more will likely follow. But if we start to compare language justice to other kinds of justice, like ecological justice or economic justice or social justice, the questions this book poses is how well can we follow that model, and how well are we able to articulate those demands, how clearly, especially when language is something that's quite ephemeral, it's not visible, like the way we can see, you know, bird's eye pictures of the Amazon burning, for example. You know, so there's the aspect of how do we think about this loss? How do we understand it? And how do we do that at a scale that might change the situation to lead to more justice for especially for the people who are most affected by these shifts? And there have been, of course, actions in this direction. The UN has stated that 2022 to 2023 is the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. There have been various declarations that have touched on language rights, such as the Universal Declaration of Linguistic Rights, the Declaration of Cultural Diversity and its Action Plan, the Convention for Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and recommendation concerning the promotion and use of multilingualism and universal access to cyberspace. But overall, these have not led to robust reinforcement of linguistic diversity. And the book proposes that the problems that are dealt with in these texts are deeper than our ability to really cope intellectually or legally with them, and hence the need to reflect and reframe language justice in the midst of these very complex and interrelated planetary crises. And so So the editors propose this idea of the life world of languages, and that we need to think of them not just as tools of communication or linguistic matters, but rather we need to think in a more transdisciplinary way about what languages are and how they relate to the lived experiences of the people who are speaking them over generations. How do these language communities come into being? How do they disperse, intermingle, disappear, or revive? And conversely, how relationships among speakers shape the ecological, political, and socioeconomic processes. And this is a contested area, right? When we say language justice, it's not an obvious thing because there are big questions at play, such as who should bear the cost, right? Let's say in a very, and I know that His Excellency, the Secretary General has talked about that in a very multilingual countries, we propose mother tongue education, but how do you do that when you have in Ethiopia 70 languages, right? How can that be done? So it's not to say it can't be done, but how, and also who would pay for that? Because of course it would take, it takes more effort to create the curricula, to translate, to train teachers, etc. And others question whether language diversity is really even valuable in itself. So kind of as the poem alludes to, maybe it's better if we have fewer languages, right? We're able to be here today in one space and understand one another at some level because of the shared lingua franca of English. Is that a terrible thing? It has its value, but on the other hand, people would argue, but that's not the only value that we can get from language, right? Lingua francas may be important, but should they be allowed to take over the spaces that other languages have traditionally occupied? We also see contestations in the sense of context where there is competition between, let's say, a global language, global lingua franca like English with a national language, and then with other minoritized or indigenous languages, where there's a sense that not all of them can coexist in the same educational spaces or in the same legal spaces. And there's a sense of how do we set priorities among these different languages? If we don't have a national language, for example, how do we all come together as one country to decide on priorities for our own governance, our own democracy? And at the same time, should that be at the expense of the languages the mother tongues and the diverse range of languages that are spoken across the country and in communities, of course, that often overlap in cities, right? And we also have to be careful that we don't essentialize languages to think about them being very place-based because we travel with our languages. And for example, one of the interesting things about this book project was that it was based in New York City, which is considered to be based on research, the most multilingual city in the world with around 700 languages spoken. And so we see the way that languages move with us. And so even as we talk about displacement and loss of land and loss of traditional lifestyles and life worlds, we also see the ways that languages travel, new communities are built, and languages also mix and mingle, and they are not a static entity. They have a life and a life world of their own. And there are indigenous communities, and for example, Wesley Leonard, who's one of the authors in this text, talks about the Miami language. This is an indigenous language of in the North America, let's say, in the US, who pushes back against the narratives of language loss to say, as we reclaim or we revitalize our language, to say that it has to be exactly the way that it was in history is unrealistic, right? We are people who have come into contact and live amongst many other people and other languages, and there's ways that those languages are dynamic. And so reclaiming and revitalizing that has to be on our own terms, and it might be mixes. And I'm thinking of Dr. Adrian, who shared with us at the BIE Day that Haitian Creole is a mix of West African languages, indigenous languages of the Caribbean, and also French. So language is not something that we can easily put in a box and say this is it, this is how it will last forever, and this is how it should be. So these are contested and difficult things to really put your finger on exactly when it comes to language. Nonetheless, we have to be aware of the ways that many difficult circumstances are pushing these loss of language life worlds. This goes back to legacies of colonization, decolonization, and striving for national identities, striving for global connections as well. We see the spread of English as a medium being taught in schools with ideas about prosperity and opportunity. And we see also the pushing of English, for example, by often global, North and especially, I would say, American aid agencies who often combine different kinds of development policies with requirements for English language instruction, rather than pushing for, let's say, basic literacy in the language of the countries where they're working. So you have this interconnected, complex relationship between the languages, the economic realities, the political realities, and often the ecological realities. So I think I will wrap up this section of my talk and maybe return to some of the themes as I go into my own chapter as needed. And maybe go into some examples if I have time for that. So I want to keep to time as best as possible. So the chapter that I'm presenting, again, is called Language Justice in the Digital Sphere. And it builds off of my dissertation research, which was called Digitizing Ethiopic, let's see if I can remember it, Encoding for Language Continuity in the Face of Digital Extinction. And I conducted my fieldwork here in Ethiopia, which is also my home, as many of you know, for many years, looking at the history of basically computing in Ethiopian languages, and especially those that are written in the Ethiopic script, which here in Ethiopia is generally known as the Fidel or the Ge'ez script, but internationally is sometimes termed the Ethiopic script. And I was looking into what were the early history of how supports were developed so that people could actually communicate using Ethiopian languages and also Eritrean languages that use both the Ethiopic script, and also you see use of Latin script commonly in many languages in Ethiopia. And what were the development of these tools, who was making them, what were the incentives, what were the challenges that they faced, and also what is the kind of the current digital vitality of these languages. And of course, through this project at Columbia, then I continued to expand on that research and knowledge and to prepare this chapter. And this chapter, I want to set a few terms first, just to make sure that for people who are not from my field of communication or from translation or linguistics, or even can kind of connect with the content that I'm sharing today, because sometimes there can be some fundamentals that can be useful. So, as I mentioned, there are approximately 7,000 languages currently used today. And there's a famous quote from Max Weinrich that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And it's not so easy to say exactly what is a language and what is a dialect, for example, because we have languages that are very, very similar, that are mutually intelligible, but nonetheless are called different languages, often because the identities of the people who speak them are somehow contested with one another. So maybe they say, well, we have our own country, so we have different languages, even though they're actually very, very similar. And again, people can understand one another. At the same time, you often have things that are called dialects that are completely mutually unintelligible, but they are termed as dialects because of political power. So often nation states do not want to give recognition to all the different language communities that exist in their borders. They want to privilege maybe one community over another. And so they'll say, you have a language and you have a dialect. And so it's, even when we say there are 7,000 languages in the world, it's really not an objective number per se. And we also need to understand too that languages don't map to speakers one-to-one because, of course, as we all know, many people, and in fact most people, are bilingual or multilingual. There are 23 languages spoken by more than 50% of the global population, and 96% of languages are spoken by only 4% of the global population. So you basically have a few big languages that, like our OSC languages, right? Many speakers, but then you have a huge long tail of languages that have smaller speaker populations. And then we also have to think about, as we consider languages, also the issue of script. So script is the written characters that can be used to represent languages. There are more than 300 scripts in use today. That includes both modern and historical scripts. But nonetheless, there is not a one-to-one relationship between languages and scripts. So, for example, many languages are oral. About 57% of languages are written down and have a writing system, but in many cases it's not widely used. Whereas other languages, and I wish I had some images to show, but the projector's not working, so I'll have you imagine with me. Many languages, or some languages, are written in more than one script. So an example is Azerbaijani, which has been written in Cyrillic, in Latin, and in the Arabic script in different periods of time. So you can imagine the histories that contributed to this kind of script shift, and also overlapping uses of scripts because of different empires and governance systems that have been in place there, and different allegiances with, for example, with Russia, or the Eastern European region versus, for example, with the Middle East, where the Arabic script is widely used, although not everywhere, of course, and then also with Europe. We have Mongolia that uses several scripts at different periods of times, also in overlapping ways. And then you have scripts that, again, shift. So, for example, in Ethiopia, in the early 90s, Afan Oromo, which had previously been primarily written in the Ethiopic characters, there was a switch to the Latin characters. And we see a number of Ethiopian languages that have previously not had a writing culture. Some of them take on Ethiopic, some of them take on Latin script, for example. So this is a little bit of, where the language and the writing systems relate to now technology. So when we think about technology, you might imagine the Facebook ad or the Google rhetoric, right? So a lot of these big companies, they tell us that technology is for everyone, and it brings the world together, and it's the space where, all are welcome. And you might at some point Google the first Facebook ad. It's quite lovely, but also a bit ironic, I feel. It talks about Facebook is chairs, and everyone can come and sit together and talk. And in fact, we see huge uptake of Facebook around the world, right? And we see, in fact, the whole world almost on Facebook and other social media platforms. But at the same time, we have to realize that as my field of science and technology studies and communication, we talk about the fact that artifacts have politics. So what does that mean? For example, is this chair universal? Would you go anywhere you go in the world, would you find this chair? You might find a similar chair, right? But you also might find places where people don't use chairs. Or they might have a chair that's, they might sit on the ground, or they might sit on, a small wooden bench, let's say. And so we have to think about the ways, not only, of course, chairs are a metaphor, right? But the way that these digital tools that are sold to us and proposed to be universal have particular cultural perspectives that are built into their design, and they may not serve all audiences equally. And I would have shared with you a picture of a park bench that are very common in the US and perhaps other places in the world. And you see these park benches that have armrests on the two sides, but also an armrest in the middle. Does anyone know why? Public parks would have park benches with an armrest in the middle of the bench.
Hostile furniture.
No.
Hostile furniture.
Sorry?
It's hostile furniture to dissuade the what do you call it? Homeless.
Homeless to sleep.
Exactly. So it prevents homeless people from sleeping on the bench, right? So it's telling you it's a chair, but it's not necessarily for every use and every, person to use in their preferred way. So just as we have a bench that would prevent homeless people from sleeping, we have digital technologies that prevent language speakers of many of the world's languages, in fact, most of the world's languages, of using them in a very easy and fluid way. So the reality is that many languages lack digital supports, particularly those written in non-Latin scripts. So many languages are written in Latin, which is the language that we see here, right? So out of our 4 OSC languages, 3 are written in the Latin script. And we know, for those of us who have worked with the translation team, when you move to a non-Latin script, it begins to be difficult to even format the documents. Am I right, Hadjer? It's challenging, right? And that's even Arabic, which is a very well-supported language digitally compared to many other non-Latin writing systems. And so we have research, for example, from Andras Kornai in 2013, estimating that 95% of languages will not attain digital vitality. This is a huge percentage, very concerning. Mark Davis, who is the Unicode president, former Unicode president, estimates that 98% of languages are digitally disadvantaged. And this is somebody who has worked at Google for many years and also has worked to include all the writing systems of the world. They're not done yet, but they're working on it at Unicode so that they can at least be used interoperably in major operating systems and software. So this is a big problem, right? We're not anywhere close to really equitable digital access in our current day. How do we get there, right? That's a question. And so currently we only have the major market languages that have garnered real, true support in the digital sphere. So these are the ones where the companies have, they can make their money, they can make their return on investment, and they'll go the full mile to make sure everything is working properly. Excuse me. So we also have to look at the history of these technologies to understand why there are certain kinds of language bias, let's say, in these digital tools. So, of course, digital innovation was happening in various parts of the world, but it was the US and the UK that really galvanized the technology early on and was able to export it around the world. And although it had started as a technology that supported numbers and it was designed to calculate, there was quickly the understanding that they needed to be able to support text and digital tools. And when they started exporting the technology, guess what text they supported? Well, of course, the Latin characters, and only 128 of them, because if you look at how Latin, is used, let's say to write Turkish, you would find some extra characters, right? So even though it's written in Latin, you might not find those characters in every software, in every application. I'm hoping that's not true today, but certainly in the early days, it was true because all around the world, people were using computers and that only could support these 128 characters. And so that, of course, expanded over time, but again, it was to the market languages, and it was not in an equitable way, let's say, and you see the kinds of language hierarchies that exist in the world around us, the false hierarchies, I would say, that often typically map to the economic might of different countries and different people, and you see those very much mapped onto the digital sphere. So what do I mean by that? Well, you find the colonial, the imperial languages, the languages of wealthiest countries being what the technologists call the high resource languages. And then you find languages that are of strategic interest to whom? Well, to the people often who have the money to pay for technologies to be developed. And so they're often developed for the interest of surveillance. They're developed to look at, again, the strategic means. These are countries or language communities that could be an enemy for us or a concern for us. So the US, for example, has invested a lot of money into academic spaces to create machine translation systems for languages of strategic interest to the US military and intelligence. And this is true as well for other countries. And then at the kind of lowest rung of the resource languages are languages spoken by, nonetheless, tens of millions of people. So you have here Amharic, Bengali, and Zulu, for example. So it's not that these languages are small, it's not that they're not spoken, but it's that they're under-resourced because of the geopolitical dynamics that exist. Now, one of the concerns is what happens when people can't use their language in the digital sphere because they don't find the support there. So Kornai calls this digital language extinction. And he notes three things that happen. And we're thinking primarily of young children, right? And these are people, you can, think of the kids that are born today. They never know a time before there was a phone or computer next to them. So this is a big part of their lives for many children. And when they can't use their language in these devices, they often lose they lose the practice. So for example, if they were going to text their friend, they would automatically use the language maybe that is easy to use. Maybe they have 2 or 3 languages. So instead of using their mother tongue, maybe they're then using, let's say, French or English to text. So they wouldn't even necessarily imagine that they could text in their mother tongue. They also perceive, without being told, that there's a lack of prestige associated with their mother tongue because it's not represented in these spaces, right? So we think of these tools as functional, things that we use for work, but they're also signifiers of prestige, right? Somebody having an iPhone is a big deal most places, or to have a Samsung Galaxy like we all have in our pockets now, right? This is a big deal. So when youth don't see their language there, it's a clear indication that that their language isn't really part of that modern, futuristic, exciting world of that they would like to identify with. And eventually can also degrade their competence in the language itself. So as more and more communication goes online, they're not practicing one language, yet they're practicing another. And this happens not only with languages, but also with scripts. So the writing systems can also be degraded. And unfortunately, there are indications that digital extinction can also contribute to extinction of languages themselves overall. So it's important that we think about what's happening with languages in the digital sphere, especially with young people, because it will have effects on the languages that they're using, the languages that they're fluent with, the languages they identify with in the rest of their lives. So of course, with language loss, digital technology is just one piece that is contributing, or it could go the other way. If we have tools that do support our wide range of languages, it could actually support the vitality. And there's a promise there, and I hope the OSC could be a part of that, in fact, because I think I'm very excited that we have a tide department, for example, and I think there's a lot that can be done to reverse that tide. But it has to be done, I would say, with the 3 prongs of language justice that I propose in my article. So those 3 prongs are equal access, equitable access to technology for language communities that want to have access. We also have to be aware that not every language community wants access. There's a famous case of the Mapuche community from Latin America who actually sued Microsoft for including their language in, I think it was Word. So again, especially when we recognize the relationship between language technology and surveillance, we have to keep in mind that not every community would want their language to be understood by the technology, right? They wouldn't want necessarily their language to be able to be machine translated, for example. And some some communities, such as the Hopi, they don't want anyone other than themselves to know their language or speak their language. So it's not the case that every language should necessarily have a full digital support. But with equitable access, then we also have to think about, for the communities that want it, second is, what about language integrity? So we have to make sure that the tools at play are not, as they're developed, they're not degrading the language, because otherwise it can actually have a detrimental impact on the language and the communities, and that shouldn't be the case. And so therefore, as tools are developed, it's important that they are developed with communities, with linguists, with people who understand the languages, to make sure that those things can be avoided. It shouldn't be something that's just done in Silicon Valley by somebody who, has a grammar and can just input things and say, okay, this equals this. And then the third prong, of course, is justice for language speakers. So as I alluded to earlier, we have to think about not only the ways that languages are impacted by digital technologies, but also about the ways that the speakers can be impacted by these technologies. So, we have scholars who talk about the data surveillance economy. So we use all of these tools, often free platforms, and in fact, we are the product. It's our data that is fed into these systems. And this can, these feed systems, such as recommendations for us on YouTube, it can feed us what kind of advertisements we're given. It feeds us the type of social media posts that we see and we don't see. And it can also have more dire consequences for people, such as impacting their ability to get health insurance in places where that's on an open marketplace, and discrimination can be not necessarily be tracked by law enforcement. For example, it can make it difficult for people to find work. It can even impact their possibility of being criminalized, depending on what kind of data is being collected by these digital systems. And then, of course, it can lead to surveillance, depending on which actors are collecting data, be it corporations, be it governments at times, and also even humanitarian organizations who might collect data on groups of people who are in, for example, a refugee situation, but then that data might be shared, unfortunately, with other actors who might use it against the population. So we have to keep these things in mind. So to return to this topic of language loss, and I mentioned at the beginning that this is a contested area, but from my perspective, when we think about should we care about language loss, the answer is yes, we should. When we think about communities that are losing vitality in language, there's a loss of intergenerational culture, knowledge being passed down, and also well-being. But we also need to think beyond just the communities in question to think about our whole humankind as well, in terms of the ways that our ideas and ways of knowing are very intimately tied to our languages, and even possibly our solutions for future problems. So I want to give you a little snapshot of my work on the Ethiopian context, and then I will wrap up my talk. So with my study on the digital history of the Ethiopic and Ethiopian and Eritrean languages, I looked at the early history. Now, the situation is actually representative of many digitally disadvantaged language communities globally, because we see common trends. So if you face a tool that doesn't already have your writing system there, it doesn't have your script, what do? Well, one of the things that you might do is you might start typing in Latin characters that somehow approximate the sounds of your language. And we see this a lot in Ethiopia even today. For example, Amharic, which is written in the Ethiopic scripts, you see it everywhere around you in Addis, of course, along with, of course, other languages and writing systems. But you see Amharic speakers often writing in Latin characters because it's easier. Maybe they don't have a keyboard on their phone, or they don't know how to download a keyboard, or the keyboard is just not that convenient, or they're just more used to, it's faster for them to type in Latin scripts. So this is one option. Another option is that people just switch to a different language. And in some cases, they have to seek out tools and, find out, is there a way? Do I have to buy a different phone? Do I have to download something extra? Do I have to get a font and a keyboard, etc.? So this becomes a lot of work. And when people can't do any of those things, sometimes they decide to build tools for themselves. This is a form of creative resistance. And it was very interesting to see the way that these early tools to support the Ethiopic writing system, and especially Amharic, which is a major focus, were developed. So a number of them were developed in the diaspora. So we have Ethiopians and Eritreans, often, some of the, for example, in the period of Emperor Haile Selassie, and then also in the Derg period, and even in more recent years, we saw many people leaving the country, often the scholars going out for education. We have immigrants looking for, different opportunities. And when they find new homes on foreign soils, they, of course, look for ways to communicate with their communities back home, or as well in their broader context. And so many of these early tools were developed by diaspora who were looking for ways to keep using their language and keep community connections despite distance. And we see, for example, the development of early word processing systems, fonts, keyboards, etc. And then also a focus on Unicode. And Unicode is kind of the backbone that we don't think about generally with our digital tools. It assigns a unique numerical character to each and every written character, a unique numerical number to each character that we would want to represent in the tools that we use. And if your script is in Unicode, and if your operating system and then your application supports Unicode fully, then you would be able to use your writing system in those tools. If not, then you would not be able to do that. Unless there's maybe a unique system that had been developed. But unfortunately, with these early word processing software, for example, if I type something in my own software and I send it to Rosalind, unless she has the exact same software, she couldn't open that file. And so what Unicode does is it standardizes that so that all the systems, if they use Unicode, it's interoperable. And that solved a big problem globally, because before that, if I was writing in Arabic, and I sent, those Arabic characters were matched, let's say, to this 128 bits, and I send it to Hadjer, and she, opens it in a program that is mapping those numbers to, let's say, Japanese characters, then she would not receive my message accurately. And so Unicode is the backbone of our global internet, and it makes multilingual computing possible. So it's a very important step for writing systems and for the languages that use them to be included. And so there was a massive effort when it came to Ethiopic to have it included. And in fact, it was the first African script, indigenous script of Africa, to be included in Unicode in 1999. So that was a big milestone. And I think it's something that's one of the reasons I was interested in history, is because it was quite a victory in that sense. But it took time to include additional characters. So the first set only supported characters for Amharic, Tigrinya, Afan Oromo, Tigray, and Ge'ez. And of course, that was when Afan Oromo was written, or had been historically written in the Ethiopic script. In 2004, additional characters were added for Angi, Blin, Me'en, Morsi, Suri, Sabat Bet, Guragi, and or Sabat Bet, and Zamtenya, Zamtanga. And in 2009, additional characters were added for Basketo, Gamo, Gofadaro, and Gumuz. In 2021, characters for Gurage were added. So this is an ongoing process. So currently, the Unicode standard supports 161 unique scripts, but there are another 150 still on the roadmaps. So we're still not there in terms of supporting all of our writing systems, but we've come a long way, especially for the Ethiopic languages. I also looked at the digital vitality of Ethiopian languages and Eritrean languages that utilize the Ethiopic script, and found that, in fact, Amharic was considered to be, it has a digital vitality, but many other Ethiopian languages do not currently enjoy robust support on the 23 key software and operating systems that you would hope to see. So there's still a long way to go. And I also looked at how we see the use of Amharic, in particular on Facebook, and found that while it's being used and the rates of use are increasing, meaning more people are coming online, more people are using the language, which is, those are, let's say, positive things, you still see more than 50%, this is in 2017, more than 50% of Amharic contents on Facebook being transliterated into the Latin script. And so for those of you who might have children, who, let's say, my Ethiopian colleagues that might have children, I want you to reflect on whether your children know the Fidel and know the Ethiopic characters as well as you do. Are they learning them in school? Are they using them then when they come home in their communications? Because it's important, I think, that we reflect on how these tools affect that. So in some ways we see, a lot of positive elements of the story of the Ethiopic digital support, such as grassroots efforts. We see pushes for inclusion at the level of global governance institutions. We see use of it online. But on the other hand, we still see areas where those things need to also increase unless we accept that script shifts will happen, for example, in a more serious way in Ethiopia. And one of the areas that I highlight when it comes to language integrity with Ethiopic is that this is concerning to me that script shift is happening because the Ethiopic script, one, it holds multi-levels of meaning. So each character is not just a representative of the sound of the language, but it actually historically, and for people who understand, even currently has a numerical and religious meaning associated with the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition. So when you transliterate and you write it in Latin characters, you're losing levels and levels of meaning. And for example, you have the oldest Bible in the world found in Ethiopia. So if we're losing our understanding of the writing system in which these kind of texts are written and many other ancient texts, we could actually lose access to the knowledge that is contained in these texts. And we've seen this in other contexts. For example, in Vietnam, which previously used the Hanzi script, switched to the Latin script after French colonial imposition. Now, scholars that want to go back in the archives of Vietnam, they have to bring scholars from China to read their archival materials. So this is a serious concern for our own understanding of our culture, knowledge, and wisdom that are passed down to us. We call our traditional knowledge and our ancestral knowledge. So I'll end off on the surveillance side. I don't have a lot, I wouldn't say I'll bring examples necessarily from the Ethiopic side, but I think this is a point that I would raise also as we think about from our work in the OSC. As we work to support languages, I think we also need to be careful about whether we are also putting communities in risk. So for example, with Gressis, let's say we hope to host a lot of indigenous materials, which would be wonderful to share knowledge across languages and communities. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant that as we make languages available online, they will be sucked into these large language models that companies like Google and Facebook are developing. And they have a goal of understanding or being able to translate all languages. Now, the level of understanding is a question, right? And our translators know that. It's not simple to translate between languages. It's not an equal to equal process. But they want to include these languages, and they're getting better at translation to the point where they don't necessarily even need a huge corpora of text to do machine translation. And so if they can incorporate those into their models, they can also use those to do things like surveillance. And considering that a lot of the communities that speak indigenous languages are in very vulnerable situations due to many of the crises mentioned earlier, they're in a particularly vulnerable situation in some cases to surveillance from outside actors, such as in some cases governments. For example, at the U.S.-Mexico border, the U.S. Immigration Service will use Google Translate, and they'll look at social media texts that a refugee applying for asylum has on their private social media feed. They will look at those, they will translate them using Google Translate, which is not perfect, and they will make refugee decisions based on those materials. So, these tools have real life implications for people. All right, so to close out my talk, I'd say that global language justice in the digital sphere is not just about bridging the digital divide, but it requires a redefinition of whose languages and lives truly matter online and offline. And we need to consider the multi-stakeholder efforts that will be needed to really solve this issue. We have to recognize that there can be a politics of refusal where communities say, I don't want this. So these efforts have to be led by the interests of the communities themselves. And we should keep in mind that we should build for equitable access when it's wanted. Indigenous communities have a say, especially within the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, they have a saying, nothing about us without us. So it should be led by the communities themselves, much like we saw with Ethiopic, for example. And we need to make sure that tools preserve language integrity, and we need to work for justice for speakers.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, first of all, I have to thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Rosalind, and all the department for choosing me to be part of this book talk edition. This one is special. This edition is special because the author is here with us, so we can have a deeper understanding of the work that we are discussing. The chapter, I read it, and the chapter explores and investigates the relationship between technology and language justice, and how the power dynamics, political, cultural, economic, affects and exacerbate oppression and marginalization through language, which is interesting because whenever we mention language, we always see the positive aspect of language, but now language is also a mean of exasperating injustice. So, as a linguist and translator, I see this problem in many areas, and especially, as you mentioned, machine translation. And I want to speak about machine translation in social media, especially because if you translate a post on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook from English to Spanish or from English to French, and then you translate another post or even the same post, so from English to Arabic, the user can see how degrading the quality of translation is into English. And what is interesting also, Facebook gives the user the right to rate the translation, but the user, if he does not speak English, he cannot rate the translation. A translator like me can rate the translation because I can read the source text and the target text. However, the user, the Arabic user cannot rate the translation. So here another area where I can see this kind of language injustice is artificial intelligence. I am a big fan of ChatGPT. I use it at work. I use it in my daily life. And what is interesting is when I ask, and I was testing ChatGPT many times, when I ask the same question in English and I ask the same question in Arabic, I get different results. I know why, because the resources and the data available in Arabic are not enough to give me this accurate answer. But the problem is, when I get an answer in Arabic that is not accurate, there is more there is more possibility for misinformation and misleading and even fake news, especially in politics. And also there is the perpetuation of stereotypes and biases. So when you give a wrong or even inaccurate or inexact information in the language, you are giving wrong information. So, and the user here is found in two positions. He will either keep using the language, which is Arabic, and I will still receive wrong information, or I will shift using English language, but at the same time I'm losing part of my identity and I'm losing part of how I see the word, because if I'm using my language, I'm protecting my vision of the word and I'm expressing my thoughts and my opinions in a better way. So either way, I am losing something. I am either receiving wrong information if I'm using my mother tongue language, or I'm using part of my identity and culture if I'm using a foreign language, namely English. So this, of course, there are a lot of ways and areas where I can see the language injustice, and as translators, especially Arabic translators, Ulfa and I, we encounter a lot of problems, like details, how to use the hashtag, how to use Arabic language from right to left to left to right in the bios. So we are always trying, Ulfa and I, to find solutions to for this kind of problem, just because the algorithm is not very tolerant and not tolerant friendly to Arabic language. When I was reading the chapter, I was also thinking of how, as an OSC member staff, I can contribute in solving this problem, or at least participate in finding a solution. And I think the flagship programs, especially GRACES, is a good example. But also as individuals, we can do our part just by spreading the word, sharing, liking posts that we are posting on social media, and maybe conducting research, publishing research on GRACES. This is just how, as our level, we can participate in solving this problem. Also, when I was reading the chapter, I came across this very interesting sentence that Dr. Isabelle had already mentioned, which is nothing about us without us. It's very interesting because there is the same sentence that is used in a lot of OSC documents, which is building an alternative, please Ulfa, correct me, building an alternative way of development by and from the South for humanity. So I think it falls in the same meaning, that if we are trying to solve a problem in the South, regardless of the kind of problem, is it linguistic, cultural, political, we have to include these people. We cannot be only the receivers of the solution. We have to be involved in proposing a solution. So yeah, and actually I learned a lot by reading this chapter, and I invite you to read it if you are interested in these kind of topics. And yeah, I thank you again for giving me this chance. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hadjer. Now the floor is open. It's a question and answer session. We'll be taking questions from the show, from you rather, the audience. But before we do that, I'm seeing Kevedi's hand up already. Maybe want to contribute something? Question, answer? Question. Okay, that was fast. Dr. Isabelle, you're prepared?
Okay, perfect. So I raised my hand first because I didn't want to forget my question. Okay, so it's because you mentioned something about races. First of all, I read the chapter, and it was had very interesting concepts and arguments as to how the digital sphere is affecting languages. And as we were building Graces, this was one of the topics we raised, and I wanted to pose the question, how do you see the balance that you've mentioned? You said by making these languages available, it's a double-edged sword. While it does foster inclusivity and visibility, it also gives the opportunity for exploitation. So Graces is basically doing exactly that, which is open access resources to languages from the South. So how do you see us striking balance when we're uploading resources that are from different languages? The second part question on that is, we're trying to make them available in 4 languages. Doesn't that automatically, eliminate the inclusivity of other languages by just focusing on 4? I might be adding requirements to myself as I'm asking, but I wanted to hear your reflection on that. My second question is actually to Hadjer. I saw some trend, I'm not sure how big of a trend it is, but I saw some of my friends that speak Arabic using Latin instead of Arabic to text each other. And they're using, for example, like the number 7 instead of using the word, or using the letter H to have that different sound of H. I can't say it obviously, but it's not really H, so they use different numbers, and it's widely accepted that people use that back and forth. I don't see that kind of trend in any other language, including Amharic, which has a lot of different sounding things that don't really translate into Latin, like cha or ka, which don't have any equivalent, but they don't have that. So I also see that double-edged thing where although it does foster, that culture of texting and using Arabic, they're not using the script, the Arabic script. So do you think the same concept will also work for other languages? If we do have those trending, if we do have that understanding using Latin, does that mean we're going to avoid using the script itself? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Isabelle. You mentioned that a country did not want their language to be translated or used by Google. So I just want to know, in your opinion, do you think that the country or the nation state was trying to control its own public by allowing this kind of, by barring translation of or this technology? Because in this way, the public can access what is all the knowledge that is there in the rest of the world. So it's translating the knowledge from the rest of the world for their own public. So it sounds like a control for their own public than control for anything else. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Dr. Isabelle, what are the lessons for OSC? What is our takeaway? With all your research and everything, or what should we worry about as OSC? Thank you.
Thank you so much for Dr. Isabelle for this talk series. This morning, as I've been talking to you, I tried to read the chapter, and it was difficult for me to understand. But with your capacity as a good communicator and specialist in communication, I think you make a complex topic very simple. And after your presentation today, I really understand better. And thank you also, Dr. Hadjer, for your insight that helped me understand better as well a complex issue that was presented. So my question is related to the comprehension of these inequalities that exist between the languages. In your research, Dr. Isabelle, do you find some Marxist-Leninist theory, like about class dominance, that could have an impact on this digital vitality that is different from different languages can be inside it. You study the reality of Ethiopia particularly. Do you find some Marxist-Leninist theories about class dominance and social inequalities that could be involved in this, particularly in a Marxist-Leninist lens?
Don't you think that linguistic variation, linguistic variability is a barrier in bringing the world together, bringing the nations together?
Thank you very much, Dr. Isabelle, for your very insightful presentation based on the book chapter. I don't have a question, but if you allow me, I would like to reflect on a couple of points you raised at the beginning, just to add up. One is on language death, language extinction, we call it also. Well, it has been mentioned that language death may happen due to a natural disaster when the speakers just wiped out from the earth for some reason. That's true, but apart from that, I think the most recurrent situation we have, at least in Africa, is due to political, cultural, social, and even global factors. Because there are always dominant languages, either international, colonial language taking the space, or even national languages dominant than, the minority language, although spoken by only a few people. So in that case, my parents would like to send their kids maybe to international school where English or French or Portuguese is used as a medium of instruction. Why? Because these languages have political capital, economic capital, social capital. So thinking about the future of their kids, they prefer to send their kids to international or dominant language school than their own, mother tongue education schools, so kind of that. So the thing is, there is always competition, contestation, so to speak, among various linguistic groups. And the minority ones are gradually either shifting to be speakers of the dominant language, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, or, just lose interest in continuing their linguistic heritage, passing it to the coming up generation. So that also, you can see that also in language policies we have. Look at Africa, for example. We have over 3,000 languages of the 8,000 you mentioned of the global language. Almost half, a little bit less than half, are spoken in Africa. But however, how many of our African nations use their own local or national language as official languages? Very, very few, rare. They use as national language and as language of education either English, one of the colonial languages, of course. Why? It's because it's difficult to choose one over many languages. That's the challenge of multilingualism. Of course, it's not entertained in the book, but multilingualism is a serious challenge as well. Of course, it's an asset to speak for individual. As an individual, it's an asset to speak more than one language because that expands your cognitive skill. It gives you a new worldview. No two languages are alike or the same. That's why you found difficulties and challenge in translation. In Eskimos, for example, they have 50 words, vocabularies for snow. 50. If you come to Ethiopia, for example, we don't even distinguish between ice and snow. It's all barado. It's just one. So that's a challenge for translation because they don't match. So every language has got its own package. So it expands your worldview, gives you cognitive power, but then it's a serious challenge politicals to choose one over the others to be an official language. That's why many countries still stick to the colonial language as their own national language, because language is highly related with identities and identity marker, though it is first or primary purpose is to serve as means of communication. But beyond that is identity marker, political identity marker, and so that's a serious challenge for us because it costs us a lot, economically, politically, socially, and so. Thank you so much. I really appreciate and enjoyed your talk, and maybe next time I will speak on language and politics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, thank you.
I can take your question. You can just, because you had your hand up for very long.
Thank you so much, and I thank the panelists for this great presentation. And mine is more of a contribution, some food for thought. Having worked in that field myself as part of the translation community, actually my master's degree in translation was on language as a tool to bridge the digital divide in the global south. And we talked about, my question would be up to Dr. Isabelle, and you talked about language laws, language distinction, but I would like to take it from the perspective of language economy and language power. It seems behind any language, there is a service that the culture, the community, the people is offering to humanity at a global scale, or I mean at a larger scale. On our OSC laptops, you can see it is a product that was manufactured by an English-speaking country, but the scripts on it are Chinese. The Chinese are providing services to humanity. So people are getting more and more exposed to Chinese scripts, for instance, and having interest in Chinese. My very first contact with the Amharic language was on board Ethiopian Airlines, because I just noticed that it very systematically, the cabin crew, for the announcement, they'll make it first in Amharic, then in English, and then in other languages. And that's how, with time, I got used to the language, and this awakens my interest in the language. Then we think that, and this is speaking to the idea of promoting indigenous technology at OSC. Don't we think that we can also promote language from the perspective of having or promoting the idea of a culture to have a service that they can put up to humanity, and behind that service there is an underlying language and script, be it a car manufacturer, a local car manufacturer in Ghana, integrating the Ashanti language in the different apps that are used in the car, to any Ethiopian who is trying to set up an application that will be used at a very larger scale in Amharic. So that's my contribution from the perspective of language economy and language contribution. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for the wonderful questions. It makes me think I should have just kept my remarks super short and just answered a lot of really excellent questions. But I'll do my best to answer those that were raised so far. And some of these I feel I may have to reflect more, like yours, Dr. Jim. I'll give my best, but then I think I would reflect more and write down a number of areas, because I think it takes more than just an on-the-fly remark to really think through all of the facets of that. So I'll go to the first question from Aman, or maybe two questions. He asked about what is the balance that we should consider with Gressis between our desire to have resources uploaded on the platform in different languages versus our concerns about feeding these systems of surveillance capitalism digitally, developing. So this is a very tricky question. Please don't blame me. I'm a scholar. I kind of point out problems. I'm not necessarily the one to always have the answers. So, with these questions, I think I will do my best, but I also would invite everyone to reflect on these, right? How can we take this knowledge and also think about how we apply it to the work that we do? But my initial thoughts would be that, we actually had a conversation last week with the Endangered Language Documentation Program, and they are an open access platform that holds materials in Indigenous languages and endangered languages, which map very closely onto our, a broad number of Indigenous languages. And they told us that although their platform is open access, their motto is as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And so you go on the platform, there are some resources that you can access as just anyone from the public. There are others that are only accessible by certain groups of people who have some pre-existing rights to access those, such as people from the language community itself. So one of the possibilities is that we could consider Ongress as creating kind of a graded access. At the same time, I don't know, to be honest, I'm always skeptical about the digital sphere and how private is. Are these systems able to be hacked if there was an interest? When you promise someone this will be private, how much of a guarantee can you give? This is a very challenging question, and there are trade-offs at play, right? As soon as you put those materials into a private space, you're also losing a lot of the benefits that we hope to get on Gresses, which is actually making knowledge contained, and knowledge shared in these languages available to many people so that humanity can benefit. So they're difficult trade-offs. I think the other part is to say the vulnerability that these communities face, maybe we still, we would still think that they should have access to knowledge. They should have their resources visible. Like Michael was saying, having your language visible means a lot to people, right? But at the same time, how do we address the vulnerabilities that those communities are facing in other ways? So, maybe it's not a digital solution that's going to address the economic issues that these communities are facing, or the issues of targeting of various types, or issues of social unrest that might lead to surveillance. So it's not an easy answer, I would say, but we'll keep working on it as the Gresses technical team. And I appreciate you taking the time to read the chapter so that it can continue to influence our conversations. You also asked about, should translation be into more than 4 OSC languages? Again, there's trade-offs there, right? You could imagine going to Gresses and seeing 8,000 or 7,000 languages, like metadata translated. That's not realistic, right? But we also have to think about the way digital tools open up new possibilities that our pre-digital media didn't. So for example, when you print a book, you have to choose what language it's going to be printed in. But on a website, we have personalized approaches at times, right? So if we had a way to sense or to ask the user their preferred language, kind of like Gresslearn, I think they do that, right? At some point, then you could choose to show their material in the language they prefer versus limiting it to our 4 OSC languages. But that's complex, right? It takes, as we know, it takes money, time to actually translate materials. So at a push of a button, you can't just translate 1 million resources into a new language instantaneously, right? So we have to think again about the trade-offs of these kind of approaches. But I think it's something I would welcome. And I feel that His Excellency Secretary General also has alluded that we would like to expand beyond the 4. So hopefully we can do that incrementally and maybe consider that personalized approach as well, so that we can reach beyond just maybe 100. A lot of platforms support about 100 languages and that's it. But it would be nice to go beyond that, because I think we can do better than Google and Facebook and those people. I hope, at least from our philosophical perspective, we would like to do that. All right, so the second question was from Dr. Wajihas. You asked about the case where there was, I think you were mentioning the Mapuche who sued Microsoft saying, we don't want you to support our language in Microsoft Word. Now, this is a case that got a little bit of news coverage, I think, because it was kind of an interesting conflict, right? But I could never find an article that really explained it, to be honest, like really who was behind the lawsuit, because it was presented as if this indigenous community was behind the lawsuit. But I don't know if it was really at a government level. I doubt it, though. But I think your concern is real. Countries do limit translation, access to educational resources in a language. There are countries that don't want certain scripts and writing systems in Unicode even. They block it because they don't want to give more power to that community, or they want to limit the knowledge that that community can attain. And we've seen this even with ShiftScript. There have been communities that have been legally forced to change scripts. Why? Because you have effectively made everyone illiterate suddenly. And that's a very powerful tool if you want to disenfranchise and take away political power from a community. So I very much acknowledge what you're talking about, Dr. Waziha. I don't know if in that particular case that I cited, that was the impulse. But I know in South Asia, there have been, for example, in India, the government has actually tried to block digital resources being developed by communities. And interestingly, in South Asia in particular, there's a lot of new scripts being developed. So language communities that have not had a writing system, or maybe have adopted a writing or a script from their surrounding, have been said, no, actually, we want our own scripts. We want our own writing system. And by getting it recognized by Unicode, it's a way for them to assert that their group has a very distinct and solid identity that should be recognized politically and should be, given resources by the government. So there's some very interesting dynamics at play between what's happening in the digital sphere, what's happening at the level of governments, where they want to suppress at times, which this goes to one of my concerns for Dr. Jim, the role of government at times where it's not always working at the interests, especially of indigenous communities and minority communities. So I do acknowledge that is definitely a dynamic that can happen. Language can be used strategically to divide and to disenfranchise and to limit knowledge to certain groups, unfortunately. I hope I answered your question in a way, Dr. Ziha. So, to Dr. Jim, what are the lessons for OSC? What should we be worried about? I think there's a number of aspects here, and hopefully, yes, worried is one. The other is innovating. What should we be innovating about? I think both are very fruitful conversations to be had. I think worried, I think when we talk about digital innovation, we have to be careful about the techno-optimism, the rhetoric that we hear from the Googles and the Facebooks about this is for everyone, it's all great, it's all beautiful, it's just inclusion. And we have to look at the underside of what are these technologies, how can they be weaponized? How can they be used against people? Even when that's not the intention of the developers, but we have to think about the vulnerabilities that can exist. And like I said, I think I'd like to actually sit down and write out some things that I could share with you, and then anyone else that would like to read, we could think about that more. Vulnerabilities. I do worry at times with the OSC about this tension between governments and indigenous people, for example. That's why the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues exists, for example, is that indigenous people are saying we need to have a say in our own, in our own governance. We can't rely on the governments of the states that we are encompassed by to necessarily, work for our interests. And so this is a very challenging issue. I don't have an easy answer to it, but I do wonder about that tension at times in some of our statements and things. And I think it will be interesting, for example, at the Congress to see how those interests are balanced in terms of how we are articulating the third way of development, for example. And it's not to say governments are bad. I think there's a very important role for governments to play in the Global South, for example, on promoting the languages and building the technologies and making sure that languages are, having a vitality and serving their communities. There's a huge role there, and it can be very positive. And I think it's very important that we have strong governments in Global South that can also stand up to those powerful corporate and government interests from the global North. Corporations they're a very big player in this field, for example. So it's not to discredit the governments, but it's also to say, how do we balance those different interests? When it comes to innovation, I hope we do a lot more things also with languages from the OSC, starting from infrastructure levels, such as even Unicode. As I mentioned, there are about 150 scripts that have not even had that very foundational level of support at Unicode level. And guess where they come from? They come from the Global South. So rather than letting maybe just, the Silicon Valley group do the work of supporting them, maybe there could be a role for more sort of governance and support from Global South institutions such as ourselves on that level, as well as the NLP level. Maybe there's ways to build machine translation systems that only work for certain people. I'm not a scholar, I'm not an expert in encryption, but there are ways to build things that only work for some and don't work for others. Kind of like language. Language is designed to be legible to some and not to others. And that's one of the ways that we use languages, to make sure we can communicate messages without everyone hearing about it. And so there may be ways to build also technologies that don't make us completely transparent to others. So that's a very, the insufficient answer, but hopefully a starting point. Okay, so Dr. Adrian, thank you for your question, and appreciate that. I'm glad to hear that the lecture at least illuminated a bit more the text. You asked about Marxist-Leninist theories of social inequality and whether they had a relationship to this topic. So I would say that, I am I'm familiar with Marxist and Leninist theories. Like, you take me back to my undergrad years, I had to read some things, but I'm not, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a Leninist, and I'm not fully utilizing those theories in my own work. But I would say that my work definitely draws on on some of those traditions in terms of critiques of capitalism and the way that capitalism serves the marketplace and doesn't necessarily take into consideration the public good. And that's where we need institutions like the OSC, we need institutions like government to come in and fill those gaps and make sure that we're not just speaking the languages that Google decides to support. That's not, in my opinion, that's not the way we would like the world to be developed. And I think we need to take an assertive role in how we can build tools that will deliver us the future that we would like to have, and not just sit back and complain as well about what these big companies are doing. So I know that's probably not the answer exactly, because I'm sure you could go deeper on this question, but maybe over coffee one morning we can talk about, you can enlighten me on the Marxist and Leninist theories that would better inform my work. I would love to hear more about that. Okay, so the next question was about linguistic variation and variability. Is it a barrier in bringing nations together? So I think this is from you, Dr. Suchi. And yes, I acknowledge that language is often a barrier in bringing nations together. And I think, that's also one of the reasons I chose the poem to read at the beginning, because it touches on that ambiguity of, wouldn't we all like to have one language? But at the same time, that's also not there's a lot that we would lose if that was the case, right? So of course, it is true that, language can be a barrier, but it has so many other roles that I think it's very hard to say, let's break down those barriers and just have one or only one. And I think one of the things that I think is very interesting about the Global South and the language diversity that has continued to flourish, especially in Africa, because we haven't seen the rates of language extinction in Africa that we've seen in the rest of the world. And I think it's interesting to look at why that resilience exists. And one of the reasons is that multilingualism is a normal part of life in many communities. So it's not like languages are just boxed into their little areas and they don't intermingle. No, in many communities, it's a normal part of people's day to be speaking 4 or 5 languages. And I think with the education systems that we've often inherited from the global north, language is seen, it's treated as something very concrete, limited, and there's been a lack of interest in thinking, how do we have multilinguality be a normal part of the education experience? Maybe not every person understands every single thing that's said in the classroom, but maybe that's okay. Maybe that's also a lesson for students about how to live in a world with diversity and multilinguality. That's a very utopian idea, but take it for what it is, if there's any value there. At the same time, there are some, again, kind of utopian visions of maybe how technology can help us achieve both a world where linguistic diversity flourishes and reducing the barrier. So, I never trust, these companies, but what they say, but, imagine a metaverse where you can speak your mother tongue and the person who's receiving your message immediately hears that translated into their mother tongue. And then they can speak their mother tongue back to you and you hear it in your mother tongue.
That's good.
Is that possible? Maybe. I don't know, right? There's a lot of issues there about who has access to the metaverse and which languages would even be translated, because we're so behind on some and some are so advanced. So it's not that I'm saying that that would be possible, but we can at least, I would like to not just say, let's forget about the value of language diversity and just go for one language. Let's think more creatively about maybe how we can activate the value on both sides of having common communication, but also having the languages that bring with it so much of our ancestral knowledge as well, and our identity and things like that. So, good. So, Professor Hiro, thank you for your illuminating comments. They're very relevant to the talk, and we look forward to your book talk on such topics. Yes. Very, very interesting. These are difficult challenges. It's not to say that I know the answer to how to, meet the economic interests of the parents who send their children to learn the global north languages, and how we can think about maintaining multilingualism, but or how to bridge the fact that choosing one indigenous language of a country over others, how to bridge the fact that that feels like pushing one group up and pushing other groups down. The dynamics are very real. There's a real reason that, the sort of colonial languages are still used in many contexts as the lingua franca and as the one to bridge and have that important national identity, because without having a national unity, you don't have a chance to even make your place in this very, challenging global world, right? That's very important to have a national identity, ideally, without losing also the multivariated identities that people also carry with them. So you will articulate that much better than I can further, but I wanted to just acknowledge that. And Michael, I appreciated your contribution as well. I think you're absolutely right about the relationship between economy and language power. And I would encourage you to read the book. I think there's a number of, not just my chapter, but there's so many interesting pieces in there about that relationship between, the economy and the ecology and the language. I think it's interesting to think about your example of Ethiopian Airlines, and I've had other people mention that to me recently. Kibratana Kibran. They always start with that. I don't know what they say, and then they have the, it's a recorded message, right? And it plays in my mind because I use Ethiopian Airlines so much. It's a beautiful thing. And, I think, as I said, I had some images I wanted to show. Actually, one of them is of the Ethiopian Airlines plane, and they use the Ethiopic script there. It says Ethiopia in the Ethiopic script. And I just always love seeing that when I'm at the airport and seeing the plane come. And it's, these public markers are really important for language, that identity and building interest and knowledge. And I think it might be an area that the OSC can think more about. I love the inclusion, as I mentioned, of the languages in our recent BIE Day. And how can we give more visibility to languages, more excitement about them, and more celebration, and more kind of even learning them, right? Even learning the languages if we can. So, yes, I liked your examples of using languages in different kind of apps and things. Ashanti language used in car apps, etc. I think that's kind of similar to the Ethiopian Airlines example, and it's great. It's a great example, bringing language into our marketing, our branding, and our industries, and our culture. So, yeah, I think that's fine for me, Rosalind. And I don't know if I feel like, we're already over time, so I don't need a final remark.
Just to answer Emmanuel's question, Arabic is a special case. We use the Latin scripts for two reasons, but I will only speak about the North African Arabic. We use the dialectal Arabic, not the standard Arabic, and the spell check is based on standard Arabic data. So when I use the dialectal Arabic, for example, if I use the word tuhashtak in Arabic and I'm using the Arabic script, the spell check will not give me the word. It will not even permit me to click on it and use it. There's why sometimes I use the Latin script. And another reason, and there are a lot of projects and startups that are trying to create spell checks with dialectal Arabic. But the thing is, we do not have training data. We do not have enough data because all the articles and everything published on the internet use standard Arabic. So this is a bigger problem in Arabic because we have the standard one we used at universities, and the dialectal we use it in chats and everything. And another reason also, especially in North Africa, we use French and Arabic in our text, in our messagings. So for example, if I start using the Arabic script and I want to shift in using French, it will be hard for me. So that is why I stick on using Latin script. But as a linguist, and because I'm an adult now, I think I feel the social responsibility. So I started using the Arabic script, even though it's a little bit hard than using the Latin word, or I use a foreign language. So Arabic is very hard, but I think there are a lot of promising projects that are trying to develop scripts and keyboards and spell checks based on dialects. Let's see if they will succeed. I hope so. So thank you.